Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Events Series. Sadly, this is our last event for this semester, but we will start up. That was not supposed to happen, but we will start up again in September. Thank you very much for your interest, for joining us today. And the event today is called The Cold War and the New Cold War, re-evaluating the global order from World War II to the present. As you will know, the global media is increasingly referring to Western relations with Russia and China as a new Cold War. We will ask today whether or not this makes any sense. Is there actually something like a new Cold War going on? And we will also look at the real Cold War in the 20th century and consider the new findings and new interpretations of this horrible conflict, which wasn't actually all that cold. There were also plenty of very real casualties. We only have to think of the war in Korea and the Vietnam War and of events in South America and Eastern Europe. And there were also many other conflicts. 4 distinguished scholars will help us to understand both the Cold War and the so-called New Cold War. It's a great pleasure to welcome our 4 special guests today who join us from the US, from the UK, and from Canada. Professor Kristina Spohr is from the London School of Economics and joins us today from Cambridge in the UK. Professor Lorenz Luethi is from McGill University and joins us from Montreal. Professor Petra Goedde is at Temple University and joins us today from Philadelphia. And Professor Charles Maier joins us from Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And today it was a very warm and sunny day in Chapel Hill, quite hot actually, but now I believe a thunderstorm is coming. I've been organizing the Krasno Global Events Series since 2012, and we are still going strong. As you know, the Krasno Event Series at UNC always deals with issues of global concern. We have a great website, krasnoevents.com, and also a popular YouTube channel that is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. Tonight, each of our guests will talk for no more than 10 minutes, and I will then ask them a few questions. Before we open it up, 2 questions from you, the audience. As always, please submit your questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our excellent Krasno assistants, today Brianna Weaver and also Mark Reeves, will select the questions and read them out aloud. Brianna is actually graduating this in the next couple of weeks, I believe, and she will be leaving the Krasno Event Series, and she wants to spend some time in South Korea. And Mark Reeves just got his PhD, and Dr. Reeves will go and take up a job as an assistant professor in Alabama. We are also very sorry to see him leave. And as there tend to be so many great questions, unfortunately, we cannot select every question which is being asked. But when you ask a question, and please ask many, please mention your name and your location when writing down a question. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight to our Krasno event at UNC on the Cold War and the New Cold War, re-evaluating the global order from World War II to the present. I've asked all our speakers to address 2 questions. First, is there something like a new Cold War? Second, what are the new findings and new insights scholars have recently gained about the real Cold War in the 20th century? Our first speaker today is Kristina Spohr. Kristina Spohr is a professor in international history at the London School of Economics in the UK, and she joins us today from Cambridge in Britain. Previously, she held the Helmut Schmidt Chair at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, DC. Among her many books, she has recently published Post-War, Post-Square, Rebuilding the World After 1989. And the book was published by Yale University Press in 2020, and I can strongly recommend it to you. Kristina, over to you. You're our first speaker.
Thank you very much for having me on this distinguished panel and asking us these very interesting questions to ponder from our different perspectives. So as you already heard, I am an expert really on the latter half of the Cold War and a contemporary historian. So let me turn the question a little bit around, coming from this period, what I call the hinge years, from the end of the Cold War phase, from let's say 1988 to 92, where I did a lot of global multi-archival research, and look a little bit back from that end point. What caused the Cold War to be over, and how have we come to where we are today? Because I think if we take that perspective on what ended, we can also see some of the crucial hallmarks of how we could explain what the Cold War was. So what ended, and how have people explained and looked for endings? For some people, the end of the Cold War occurred in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that ties in some ways back to the Anthony Vasori argument that perhaps the beginning of the Cold War lies in the ideological conflict with the emergence of the Soviet Union already well before the Second World War, going back to 1917. For others, the ending of the Cold War has to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall, German reunification, the revolutions of 1989, the collapse of the wider Soviet Empire. And that perhaps locates the origins more tied up with questions: what was with the power vacuum after the Second World War in Germany, the division of Germany, the cockpit of the Cold War in Europe. And one could also go even further back and think of those scholars who consider the ending of the Cold War to begin with the diffusing of superpower, arms race, and antagonism, namely if we think about the Gorbachev-Reagan symmetry between 1985 and 1988. So we can already see there's sort of different endpoints, and that points us also to think about how scholars have tried to tackle and define what this Cold War that ended may have actually been. So we could look at the Cold War as, of course, an international system, a bipolar system where we have two key powers around which sort of pull towards the pole others, two centers of power, if you want, two superpowers, and that this international system, this bipolar system, affected all sorts of areas: the polity, the politics, economics, military, and cultural. And that surely this bipolar order with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the wider empire was did finish at the end of 1991. Something else came, something that politicians at the time grappled with and thought of: is this now the post-Cold War world? Or actually, perhaps, as some American politicians thought, were we going into a post-war phase, if indeed the Cold War was a long drawn out post-war, post-1945 phase? So something they toyed with, if you look at these memoranda in the State Department and the White House. How would you actually call where we were going to? But I think there's something else to think about also, that if we think about this binary system, each side tried to consider themselves as the absolute. It had something to do with a zero-sum game. And I think one important hallmark, of course, was the ideological antagonism and how much came from that. So I think ideology really mattered, because it affected many areas. In fact, perhaps most areas: the domestic and the international sphere, the socio-economic system, this whole thing about the plan versus the market. Then, of course, if we think about these camps in some ways, the parliamentary democracies, or even we have presidential systems, but on the whole liberal democracies, multi-party systems versus one-party state communist ideology. Then, of course, if we think about it more broadly, how these poles pulled in different states, there is that interesting terminology that Guy Lunderstadt put out, that on the one hand, we had the empire by imposition on the Soviet bloc side, if you think about Europe, and of course, on the other side, perhaps the empire by invitation, the US camp, perhaps even the empire by integration, America as a European power. Something that again came also out at the end of the Cold War. Would America remain in Europe? Would America remain a European power, or a power simply in Europe that to a large extent would withdraw? So this antagonism was expressing itself in particular where that first cockpit after the Second World War occurred, namely in Europe, also through the emergence of the two military blocs. And that leads me to a second point, namely technology and arms race and the fear of nuclear Armageddon. Absolutely essential. and that because of that fear of the zero-sum situation, the fear of the nuclear Armageddon, people really worried, would there be a third world war caused through this antagonism between the two superpowers and the blocs? And that every now and then got heightened by certain agents. If we just think, for example, of the Reagan presidency. I've mentioned Reagan before as a protagonist in the diffusing of the Cold War, but of course also caused a lot of fear. That is also how we have to see the second wave of the peace movements occurring on the Western European plain. So if we keep these things in mind, and we think also how that played into what was called at the time the third world, perhaps more politically correctly today, we often speak about the developing countries. The superpowers influenced developments there, but on the other hand, also the countries that were coming and the liberation movements that were coming in zones of decolonization did look to the superpowers to actually, they were opportunists. They were trying to gain something. They were playing out which social system, which way they should be going economically, socially, politically. So in some ways it worked both ways. And so at, let's say, a sub-level within that binary system, we had these different protagonists. So let me come to this question, what ended? We can look at both systemic and, in other words, structural and agency factors. I think we can all agree that, of course, on the systemic level, we saw already for a long time the weakening of the socioeconomic system. The plan didn't work. The civilian goods weren't there. The people were looking culturally and in terms of their living standards to the West, in particular, if you think, for example, about Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So there's weakness in the system, but that alone didn't bring the system down. So I think that is really important to bear in mind. We needed a change agent, and that change agent in several ways was Gorbachev, who, by the way, wanted to reform, wanted to reinvent communism, wanted to reinvent and make the Soviet Union stronger, more competitive, but in a benign way. He wanted co-development. He wanted, in some ways, a bipolar cooperation. He wanted rapprochement in terms of values, perhaps something that had been learned in the phase of détente before, but it's a rebalancing of power because he felt the Soviet Union was on the losing side. To do that, he wanted to diffuse the Cold War. And interestingly, Reagan, for all his hardcore rhetoric, went along. So we have that synergy at that superpower level. And crucially, Gorbachev abdicated the Brezhnev doctrine, the application of the use of force. And by that, he galvanized something, and also by propagating freedom of choice in the Eastern Bloc, whereby people lost the fear of the tank. That was also helpful for people to sense that they could go and protest in the street. That in some ways also helped galvanize, in some ways, the people power, but also the reform communists in those individual countries, especially in the Eastern Bloc. And that's how we have to understand the synergy of the Eastern Bloc collapsing one by one, which leads me to that symbolic moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall and to one of the cockpits of the Cold War, namely that German division. Now, if you think that one of the big problems had been, in particular, Soviet fear of German invasion, German unification brings this all back onto the international agenda. The fear of a unified Germany. And in some ways, the way unification is being brought about is also an ending, a reconciliation between the Soviet Union and Germany, the anchoring of a unified Germany in Western organizations, which actually has something to do with how the architecture moves as we go out of the Cold War. And thereby we close off the post-war era, if you want, that German historical problem, as well as we see through this unraveling of the Soviet bloc, of that wider Soviet empire, culminating then in the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But remember, this is not in that sense a triumph of the West, because the Soviet Union did not collapse because of the Americans. In fact, the West tried to keep Gorbachev and the Soviet Union going as long as they could, as the devil that they knew. It came as a shock when the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991. And for that last minute that I have, let me just use another word. Because when we talk about the Cold War in this way, and we, in that sense, end up having a slightly Eurocentric view, it has to do with that word ending. Let's use a different word and say, how did we exit the Cold War? How did the exit of the Cold War look like globally for that international system. And then you find the Soviet collapse is one story. The second reinvention of a communist China as an authoritarian communist regime that, however, adopts capitalism, does take a completely different exit out of the Cold War, which has major repercussions for where we have gotten today. That unipolar moment that emerges in 1991 with the Americans running the sole superpower, the triumph of the West, these ideas of this heady moment that somehow the West won will over time disappear when we start looking at other issues that emerge as we entered a phase in some ways of disorder. Rogue states, North Korea, for example, with nuclear weapons, eventually a revisionism of Russia that did not become democratic, and China's own inexorable ascent and desire to become a leading power that will hopefully in its own mind at some point when it has enough power seek to rewrite that rules-based order as it is. And that is where we are today. If you think about Putin talking about wanting a post-West world order, the Chinese wanting to have recognized a multipolar world order, and the United States trying to grapple how they deal with China and also how they deal with Russia, because it's simply there, whatever we may say of its economic problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was most illuminating. Let me ask you, for many in the United States, it really was Ronald Reagan who brought the Cold War to an end. How important was Ronald Reagan? Was he important at all? Was he overly important, or how does he fit in?
Well, I think that's where we can tie into some of the colleagues who will follow me in a minute, because Ronald Reagan is quite interesting. Remember, he ratcheted also up the Cold War. You know, some people have spoken of that second Cold War, these speeches of SDI, of that evil empire. In fact, things got much worse in the early 1980s. In fact, it galvanized, in some ways, also the sort of intellectual peace movement left in Western Europe. People hated Reagan. People hated anything to do with intermediate nuclear forces. Ironically, it's the same guy that once he has Gorbachev as an opposite number. And it's not that Reagan didn't try. In fact, Reagan did try to also reach out at the same time as he was making all these wild speeches to Soviet leaders who kept dying on him. 3 Soviet leaders died in 3 years on him. But when actually Gorbachev comes to the plate and they both step up to it, you have a very interesting synergy where there's sort of almost a meeting of mind, which also the advisors on both sides thought was almost crazy. Namely that they dream of this non-nuclear world. They want to get rid of nuclear weapons. And so it is a major achievement to have that INF treaty in 1987, just those very intermediate nuclear weapons that had come about through the Soviet SS-20 buildup in the 70s, and then the follow-up by NATO through Cruise and Pershing II missiles in Europe. Those very weapons that just put in all the money and spent on those weapons are being reduced. It's actually the first time that a whole category of nuclear weapons is reduced to zero. That is a very important part in the ending of the Cold War, in the sense of diffusing the Cold War. It makes more talking together, more seeking cooperation, more proper rapprochement possible. Without me saying that whatever happened afterwards was a one-way street. That is not what I'm saying. But I think that something changed in the atmosphere that one would engage.
So Reagan was quite essential. That's what you're saying.
Reagan was essential in 2 ways. Once making it worse and then also making it better.
Okay, that's good. Good summary. What about the new Cold War? Do you think the term the new Cold War should be applied to our bad relations at the moment with both Russia and China?
I think we have to be careful because, as I highlighted before, if we explain what was the Cold War and we tie that to a particular era and to a particular type of international system, then we are not now looking at the same thing. In terms of a rebalancing of power and a desire by some to rewrite the order as they perceive has been created after 1945, the Australians would say a US-anchored international rules-based order. That is what the Chinese are challenging. That is what the Russians in their own way are challenging. They want that rebalancing to be expressed in different ways. They want to emphasize the inviolability of borders more than, let's say, a focus on human rights. So they want that acknowledged. But we are not looking at an exporting of ideas on both sides in that same kind of ideological way. Yes, China is a communist state, but it is a communist capitalist state. We are looking here at something else. We're not looking at China making client states and trying to create lots of little communists. We are seeing a geostrategic and a geo-economic determination of seeking influence. And we see also a curious synergy, for example, how Russia and China act in areas such as, for example, the Arctic, but I'm happy to talk about that at another point today. So that the Americans find themselves pitted against these two quite different powers who in some ways have a slightly unholy engagement with each other in several areas.
Okay.
But in that sense, it's more like a balance of power problem as we had perhaps before the Cold War.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. We will discuss that further, undoubtedly, in the next few minutes. We come to our second speaker, that is Lorenz Luethi. Lorenz is a professor of history at McGill University in Montreal in Canada. He has held many distinguished fellowships and visiting professorships, and he has just published the much-praised book entitled Cold War, Asia, the Middle East, Europe. It came out with Cambridge University Press in 2020. Over to you, Lorenz.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the panel, and welcome to everybody. Professor Larres has given us two questions, and I will start actually with the second one, and then I will end up with the first one at the end of my 8 or 10 minutes. So what are the trends and scholarly findings in the study of the Cold War in the 20th century? So let me start with that, and that then will naturally lead to the first question. Now, let me confess at the very beginning of my talk that I have lost any sense what the field of Cold War history is really about. Until around 20 years or so, or 25 years or so ago, it was relatively easy to identify the main controversies or debates in the field of Cold War history. But the field has become so incredibly big that it is, in my view, or has been already for some times in the process of fragmentation. At least in my view. This is related to the opening of new archival holdings across the globe since the late 80s and 90s, the growing number of practitioners of Cold War history throughout the whole world, an increasing amount of literature published in languages other than English, the exploration of topics and themes that are well beyond the classical Cold War topics in political, diplomatic, and military history, and so on. So, the picture of Cold War historiography offers us that we face now is not simply a couple of planets orbiting around the sun, right? It looks more like a supernova exploding with great force into all directions. That's how the field looks like to me. So what are the trends I see? And I can really only scratch the surface here. What I see, what has become really, I think, standard in some of the fields is multilingual and multi-archival research. Really a shift away from just studying American archives and maybe the former Soviet archives and British archives. Now, there's an attempt really to go everywhere. Now, some archives, unfortunately, are closing down, like in China, and in some cases, it still is very difficult, like in Vietnam, and not possible, like in North Korea. But in general, the trend is we have more access to evidence, and that really substantially revises the way we look at the Cold War. I also see, in my view, a trend towards more intellectual history in the Cold War, and I define intellectual history very, very broadly. That includes human rights, economics, decolonization, the peace movement, other international movements, right, that emerge in the global South, for example, and so on. And with that, of course, also a move away maybe from a Eurocentric interpretation of the Cold War to a non-European centric interpretation. Probably a greater emphasis on local agency, shift away from a superpower-focused lens of interpretation. And I also think maybe a move towards an entangled history, so that we see actually how various maybe national and regional developments are really connected to each other horizontally, not necessarily only connected to the superpowers in vertical fashion. So given that I just published a book on the Cold War, which you can see here to the left, Cold Wars, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe,
Good market.
Where did I come from, and where did I decide to go in this book? This is really, the culmination of 20 years thinking about the Cold War. So let me just give you maybe my intellectual, path to the current point in time. Now, I was trained in Yale as a PhD by one of the leading Cold War historians of the time in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And most of his publications were focused on US foreign relations. That was understandable because American archives were the only ones that were really accessible in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But then in the 1990s, there was sort of a pioneering cohort of historians who wrote actually on the Soviet Union. Think about Petra, about Zubok. And they really published sort of the counterpoints to this American-focused superpower historiography. And then, at the same time, historians increasingly try to write general interpretations of the Cold War. And I have a list here with me. Basically, every 2 years, we have a book on an international history of the Cold War. But what was so interesting is that they still often were superpower-focused and really Eurocentric. Arne Westad then really, I think, broke the spell in 2006 with a book entitled The Global Cold War, which for the first time really focuses on the Third World. However, he still is, to a certain degree, wedded to this idea of an East-West conflict and how it applies to the global South. Remember, his first and second chapter is the Empire of Justice and the Empire of Liberty, and then the rest is how these two empires actually, engage with the world. So his book is essentially about, one, how the superpower conflict actually affected the rest of the world. And it was in this context that I really felt increasingly uncomfortable. The way historians write, or at that time wrote about the Cold War. After I graduated from Yale in 2003, I moved to actually Canada. I have been teaching since, and this really was a blessing in disguise. This really removed me from an American-centric debate on the Cold War that is so prevalent in US academia. And it forced me to engage with really, really smart questions from students coming from 6 different continents. It's a very international student body here at McGill. So as I was finishing my previous book on the Sino-Soviet split around 15 years ago, I decided to track down why I felt so intellectually uncomfortable with the way how we write Cold War history. And I decided to track the reasons down. The more I read the documents on American decision-making, let's see, in the foreign relations of the United States, or of the Khrushchev period in the so-called presidium meetings, they're available in Russian in 3 volumes, the more I realized that the superpowers were mostly reacting to and not really shaping events and crises. And if this is really the case, then we have to ask who is actually, creating the trouble, right? And so I decided to turn Westad's approach on applying the Cold War to the rest of the world on its head, and I applied the world to the Cold War. Well, how did the rest of the world actually engage with the Cold War, with the superpower conflict in the first place? That was the question I tried to track down. And I could benefit on from an emerging literature from a younger group of people, not only from their publications, but from ongoing discussions I had. And I would like to use, sort of a metaphor to give you, to make the point I want to make. Often, historians have thought about the Cold War as a conflict of 2 chess players. There are 2 superpowers sitting on either side of a table. There's the chessboard, and there are the little actually wooden pieces, and they move them around, right? Now, just imagine that these 32 chess pieces have a mind and a life of their own. They are not willing always to follow the superpowers. They have conflicts with each other. They have friends. They fight each other. They make friends, and so on. That's how the Cold War looks like. And then just imagine that these chess pieces are a little bit larger than they usually are, maybe half the size of the superpower. This is how the Cold War looks like. And once you think about the Cold War in these terms, it opens up new avenues of interpretation. So many of the conflicts I describe in my book, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, are in fact conflicts of decolonization. and nation formation that interact sometimes closely and more often than not tangentially with the superpower conflict. But since decolonization was an ongoing process in 1945, or even in 1917 to a certain degree, right? It's important that we really talk about decolonization in the non-European world first before we talk about Europe. And the reason is very simple. With few exceptions, the Soviet-American clash mainly produced conflicts in Europe. There are the exceptions of the Afghanistan war, and maybe 2 or 3 other actually exceptions, but all the conflicts that happened during the Cold War in the non-European world were not rooted in the Cold War. And it's really important to understand this. Now, what are my general findings? I think small and middle powers substantially changed the nature of the Cold War over time. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the regional incarnations of the global Cold War were really vanishing, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, but in fact also in Europe. We have an integration of West and East Europe via economic and financial terms. Now, looking back, it is not really surprising to me anymore that the Cold War supposedly ended in 1989 and 1991. But what is surprising is that it took so long, a whole decade, the whole 1980s, actually to end. And that is sort of something we really have to explain. Not the collapse in '89, but why does it take so long? Another finding is that regional developments influenced each other. It's not only that events in the world regions influence the superpowers, but they influence each other horizontally. And the influence is usually moving from east to west along the periphery of the socialist world, i.e. from Asia to the Middle East and into Europe. And so this is also why I think we should move away from a Eurocentric interpretation of the Cold War. And finally, I have also a beef with just talking about the superpowers. I think we really have to reintroduce the idea of the big three in 1945. It was the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. They formed a class of great powers that were just completely removed from the rest. There's no number 4, no number 5, no number 6, and maybe Canada and Australia are then popping up as number 7 or 8. They are just in a class by themselves. And they try to influence developments across the world, that now pop up, and they are unrelated to the Cold War mostly. Just think about China, Korea, Vietnam, South Asia, the Middle East. Over time, the big three develop into a superpower, actually, into a bipolar. I call it actually a duopoly, a bipolar world, or a superpower duopoly. And what they do is they mostly seize opportunities and crises that emerge and try to nudge them into one direction or the other one. So with time in view, let me just move quickly to the second question. Does it make sense to talk about the new Cold War with Russia or China? I'm always a little perplexed by the question and the basic assumptions behind this question. It's not the first time that I have been asked this question, because it really raises the question, what's the old Cold War? When we talk about the new Cold War, we have to sort of get an agreement, what is the old Cold War really about? We usually associate this with an ideological conflict between East and West, and it was essentially rooted in a global challenge by Bolshevism to the capitalist imperialist world system, and that the aim was to replace that supposedly unjust system with a better system. That was what the Bolshevik Revolution set out from. However, literally the Cold War means the absence of hot war, which is essentially a Eurocentric view, because the Cold War essentially created a long peace in Europe, right? But the vast number of people who died in the Cold War died in the non-European world. Just think about Korea, about Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Just in sheer terms of numbers, the people who die in Europe, and there are plenty who died during the Cold War in Europe, the number who die in Europe is really very small. Each death is, of course, an unnecessary one, just to make this clear. So in the non-European world, the Cold War definitely was hot, and we have just to remember that. So given that most of us remember the Cold War or are aware of it because they have taken any of our classes, right? And the Cold War really hasn't moved into the far past yet. It's of course very seducing to think about any conflict between the United States and Russia or China as a new Cold War. Calling it so, of course, generates public attention and newspaper headlines, immediately in the news, right? I understand that this is a very good way to get into the news, but ultimately we live in a fundamentally different world now. Ideology, as two speakers have already said, really doesn't matter anymore, unless you think Neo-Confucianism a la Xi Jinping is some form of an ideology. I don't believe that. The supposed antagonists, are now closely interwoven economically. In fact, they're interdependent. That was not the case between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And also the conflicts that emerge now have not created bloody spillover conflicts as they have during the old Cold War. I expect to continue this to be the case, but I might be wrong, right? I can't see the future.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm almost done. So the Sino-American and the US-Russian antagonisms look to me more like very traditional conflicts between great powers, which, have been frequent in the pre-Cold War history for hundreds of years, right? This is nothing new what we see now in terms, maybe this is the 19th century, the balance of power period again, right? And for any of these periods, we never used the term Cold War. We used it really for the post-45 period. And I think we should just leave it at that. What we see probably is a return to older forms of international conflict, and they are fundamentally different from what the Cold War was. Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you. And you have made your views pretty clear that we shouldn't talk about a new Cold War, but just about the Cold War in the 20th century. Fair enough. And I think many probably would agree with you. But you also said the supposedly end of the Cold War. Does that really mean there wasn't an end of the Cold War? Are we still living in a continuation of the Cold War? Or what did you mean by using that word, supposed end of the Cold War?
There's this interpretation with the symbolic end of the Cold War, with the fall of the wall in 1989. This sort of meant that the Cold War is over. Now, let me just, I remember this. I was glued to the TV set. I wasn't in Berlin. I still lived as a teenager in Switzerland. I had a German mother, so I grew up with German news at the time. Of course, this was an important event for myself. But the reality is my mother worked across the border from Switzerland and southern Germany. Even southern Germans didn't really care about this. And the fall of the wall outside of Europe doesn't really have any meaning. And so this is a very local event, ultimately. I know we are all related to Germany, and I might now insult anybody here on this panel, but it really is a local event. It has an important symbolic meaning. So when I say the supposed end in 1989, I mean structurally the Cold War had already ended before. What we have to explain is, why did it take the two superpowers so long to understand this in the first place?
Right, thanks very much. That's certainly provocative. The fall of the Berlin Wall and German unification was a little local or regional affair. And that
only the fall of the wall. I'm not talking about German unification. That is important for Europe, but this is a much bigger story.
Thank you. I think we will discuss that some more in the next hour or so. For the time being, I would like to come to our next speaker, that is Petra Goedde. Petra is a professor of history at Temple University in Philadelphia. She is the editor of the leading international history journal, Diplomatic History, and she has just published the book, The Politics of Peace, A Global Cold War History, Oxford University Press, 2019. And over to you, Petra.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you for inviting me. This is a special treat. And thank you for the kind introduction. In fact, your timing, Klaus, is impeccable with this kind of topic, because just today, as most of you know, the G7 group is meeting in London discussing among other things, what to do about China and Russia. And maybe we'll have some answers for them by the end of this session. To briefly recap the two questions that Klaus asked, one is about the new Cold War, the other one about the historiography. And just like Lorenz, I will actually flip the order and talk first about the historiography. And I agree with many of the things Lorenz has said about this trend. I will call it put a little bit of a different spin on it, but it's essentially the same assessment. I think that we are actually writing our way out of the Cold War. What Lorenz called the fragmentation, I think, is an exit out of the Cold War altogether. That's not a bad thing. In fact, I have been wondering a lot about this question since I was planning and then teaching a Cold War history class to graduate students. And at the end of this class, my students said to me, we're now more confused about what the Cold War is about than before. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. So up until about mid-1970s, as Lorenz already pointed out, the historiography was mostly revolved around the superpower conflict. Historians, Orthodox revisionist historians, disagreed about whether one power or the other was largely to blame for the Cold War, but they agreed that the primary story centered on the United States and the Soviet Union. But with the cultural approach, with subaltern history, and ultimately the global and transnational turns, the perspective moved from the center to the periphery, from those representing state power to those operating under or beyond and parallel to the state. So as our gaze became global, we started noticing something else. We noticed that the Cold War could not explain everything. There were a lot of things going on in other parts of the world that did not fit into the Cold War frame of reference. And Lorenz already pointed that out in his talk. And there were lots of things going on within each of the Cold War blocs that also did not fit neatly into that frame either. So among these other processes were issues like globalization, human rights, decolonization, environmentalism. And to be sure, all of these issues and processes affected the Cold War and were affected by it, but they also operated independently of the Cold War. And it's important to understand that these processes had begun prior to the Cold War and continued beyond the end of the Cold War. And that is what I mean by writing our way out of the Cold War. As we find out more about the role of agents on the periphery, about the global dimension of the Cold War, about concerns that transcended the Cold War, we also recognize the limits of the Cold War as an agent itself. So I want to put the spotlight on one recent approach in particular, one that might help us answer the second question: what was the Cold War all about? And that approach is the history of emotions. When we pay attention to emotions in foreign relations, we could potentially argue that at its root, the Cold War was a product of imagination. And before you get all upset, let me explain that I do not mean that the Cold War was not real. The nuclear arms race was real. The military-industrial complex was real. The Korean and the Vietnam Wars were very real. People died. They died in combat. They died in electric chairs for crimes of espionage. They died in prisons, and they died of radiation poisoning and cancer everywhere nuclear testing was conducted, whether it was in Washington State, in the Pacific, or in Kazakhstan. The imagined threat produced real decisions with real consequences, which in turn produced real threats. So what I'm aiming at here is to highlight the centrality of emotions in the making and the escalation of the Cold War. Emotions such as fear, distrust, suspicion, and terror, which lay at the root of all decisions made over the course of the Cold War. So the history of emotions can help us identify these emotional, non-rational assumptions that provided the foundation for the seemingly pragmatic realist policies built upon them. So what I want to do is challenge here the long-held myth that those who devised the early foreign policy of the Cold War were actually rational actors who dispassionately analyzed risk factors, determined America's national interest, and used scientific methods to arrive at a grand strategy. Could they really be called rational actors if their policies were built upon an emotional foundation, namely fear? Those who devised doomsday plans, who propagated peace through strength, who argued that more weapons buildup led to greater security, who also argued that peace advocacy was a communist plot to weaken the West and a threat to national security. So I'm talking here about people like Albert Wohlstetter, Herman Kahn, and all those working for the major Cold War think tanks like the Rand Corporation. These people based their policies on an essentially non-rational assumption rather than hard facts, namely that the Soviet Union was relentlessly driving for world domination, that it was intent on destroying the Western way of life, and Soviet thinking was no different. Both embraced an essentially irrational policy of deterrence. When we think about the etymology of this word deterrence, we get to the word terrere, the Latin word terrere, which means frighten, fill with fear. It was an effort to instill fear and terror in the other side, to frighten them into abandoning the use of nuclear weapons by demonstrating the willingness to use them on their own. Out of this concept emerged the strategy of mutually assured destruction, aptly named MAD, and ultimately, which I believe is the height of irrationality masked as hyperrealism, Nixon's madman strategy. So this, in my mind, was what made this period we call the Cold War unique in modern history. Some of its other aspects were not new, such as its neo-imperialist tendency or its efforts to secure spheres of influence. Those mirrored earlier phases in modern history. And if we take those as the essence of the Cold War, then we might be entering a new Cold War now. But those tendencies are now increasingly gaining attention among scholars, leading some to question the unique nature of the Cold War. So that gets me to the last question. Are we headed toward a new Cold War with Russia and China? You probably already guessed right that I don't think we are. We can discern distinct elements of the current conflict that are unlike the Cold War divisions. So first, we do not experience the same kind of fear and terror when we think of China or Russia as we did during the Cold War. Secondly, the biggest conflicts among the nations today are in the realm of economics. China is actually outperforming the old capitalist countries in capitalist production. And Russia is behaving more like Britain in the late 1970s and 80s, unable to come to terms with its diminished empire. And third, the biggest threat to American democracy is neither China nor Russia. It is, I believe, America itself. It is the glaring inequalities in wealth, education, and justice, its crumbling infrastructure, its underfunded and overpriced healthcare system, and its currently, at least, dysfunctional political culture. And while I'm focusing here on the United States, the same threat to democracy exists across Europe. It manifests itself in the rise of far-right political parties and movements who have capitalized on the sense of disenfranchisement and displacement among the populations, and who use a different kind of fear-mongering to challenge the liberal capitalist democratic order that has dominated our political system for so long. And to me, these challenges pose a far greater threat to democracy than China and Russia, though they do their best to fuel that movement in the Western world. It is, in a way, an ominous indicator that capitalism is about to devour its own children. And I think the G7 powers would do well to include these internal threats in their discussions about what to do about China and Russia. That's all I have to say at this point. I will later weigh in on the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall, but I'll hold that thought until later for Lorenz.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Also very illuminating indeed. You're not very optimistic, I think, regarding the future of the West, I guess. But let me ask you the question, when you talk about emotions and fear and terror, and I think very few people would disagree with you. However, was that really unique to the Cold War or the early Cold War? When you go back to Britain and the Nazi threat, or the British-German naval race in the late 19th century, or go back to other areas in the world, there's always fear and terrors and emotions involved. So is that particularly unique for the Cold War? We can, in a way, if I may say so, we can almost explain any serious conflict by emotions and terror and fear and so on.
Yes, you're right. Emotions always play a role in these assumptions or in foreign relations. But there was another level, and that to the fear, and that was the assumption that nuclear war would destroy humanity. This was a new element in the post-war period, and that meant that Europeans, Russians, primarily Europeans and the United States, were in a permanent state of preparation for war. And that was a unique phase of the Cold War, where populations were told you have to expect war, nuclear war at any moment, where we have these drills, civil defense, in the United States, but also in Russia and to a lesser extent in Russia and Europe. But that fear was dramatic, and it led politicians to create a system that was in a way absurd, as I point out in my book on the politics of peace, where they said we need to be believable in wanting and being prepared to wage nuclear war in order to avoid nuclear war. And that had never happened before.
Is that not still continuing, that system?
Sorry?
That system not still continuing?
It isn't. It's not to the same degree. What I have noticed, and in some ways I am surprised by this, that people today are not as afraid of nuclear war as they were in the 1950s and the 1960s. I don't know whether it is that it's not so much in the public domain. I believe it is more sort of an assumption that as much as there is a conflict between the US and China and Russia, there's not the assumption that either of these countries are willing to go to war. Or unleash a third world war, because the conflicts are, because it would destroy what they have built up in terms of economic relations, trade relations, and other kinds of relationships that our societies are not as ready or to believe or to expect a third world war. And that was the case in the 1950s and the 1960s. Related to that, I feel there is a real break in the Cold War starting in the late 60s, early 70s. And we could technically argue, to throw out different periodization, that really the Cold War ended in the early 70s, and that what happened in the 1980s with Reagan was not really the restart of a Cold War, because when we look at it also from the European side, Europeans didn't want to go along with Reagan's saber rattling. They had established too many ties with the Eastern Bloc, with Eastern European countries, to throw that all overboard for a sort of galvanization of an ideological conflict. So they were always kind of rowing back what Reagan was doing, and had a tremendous sense of relief when Gorbachev finally came around, and so did Reagan in the 80s.
Thank you very much. I mean, close economic relations, or that close economic relations wouldn't lead to war, has been said before, of course. And it did lead to war when we think of the First World War. But that is something more we can discuss in the next hour or so. Let's go to our final speaker today. That is Professor Charles Maier. Charles Maier is a Leverett Saltonstall Research Professor of History at Harvard University. Professor Maier is probably the nation's leading and most well-known historian of modern German and European history. Over the years, he has published a very large number of influential books, too many to name them here. But most recently, he has authored Once Within Borders, Territories of Power, Wealth and Belonging since 1500, Harvard University Press, 2016. Professor Maier, over to you, please.
Thank you, Klaus. The advantage of batting cleanup, as we would say in American slang, is that you can see what everyone else has said. And the disadvantage, of course, is that you agree so much with it and we're planning to say it yourself. So that I will try and comment along the way with some of the observations that have been made. And I focused most of my attention on the question, are we does this notion of a Cold War, current Cold War with China and or Russia make any sense? But let me make a couple of remarks about the question of scholarship. I'm not up on the new scholarship. I mean, I try and read Petra's magazine and Cold War History, Mark Kramer's magazine, but it's not where I have been, putting most of my scholarly passion and effort into. On the other hand, I have the advantage of age. I'm a generation older than the other panelists. I remember the McCarthy era. I remember how the ideological clamp that put on the United States. And I remember the first serious challenge to the orthodox Cold War history. Stalin did it. Stalin was responsible in the so-called revisionist controversy of the 1960s, in which I sought to intervene. But this question of who was responsible so dominated the historiography of the 50s and the 60s. In fact, the first dent, I think, was in 55 with Fleming's book, but it really took off with all the turbulence of the 60s. And it was a passionate argument. This was a history that made difference. It made a difference in who you might consider to hire or not to hire. It made a difference to whom the emotions you had toward colleagues. And that passion left. And we entered a stage of post-revisionism where John Goedde sought to rise above the conflict, and I think many of us did. And then many of us went on to think about other things. I agree with Lorenz. Decolonization, in retrospect, seems to me a much undervalued theme of the time, but it was in effect the reassertion of a third world, much as the Bandung alignment became later. So I think, in a certain sense, we are, I don't mean to belittle them, but, we are looking at more specialized, more fragmented studies. We're not in the grip of a religious conflict, which was more like, Europe in 1550 than it was almost like other historical periods. The fear of nuclear war, which Petra has recognized, I think this is true, but I would point to a certain point of inflection, which is implicit in what she and the others have said. In the 50s and 60s, one did worry about, we were supposed to take precautions. I mean, some people anyway, built bomb shelters. This was considered serious things. But precisely this fear led to the strategy of deterrence, de-fearing that Petra has made. I'm not so sure it was so. It seems lunatic looking back on it, I agree, but at the time that wasn't non-rational or irrational. It had a twisted sort of rationality. It would be worth trying to explore these different concepts. I think early in the 80s, this changed. I remember the movie The Day After that was shown on television. And I remember my students from this period, many of them did think this is something in our future. It's just going to happen. There are too many bombs around. We're living too much on edge. And I think that was a point of inflection, so that the reaction to this crazy arms race in some ways was not one of trying to counterbuild, not one to master it through deterrence, but in fact through disarmament. And it led to the rest of the decade and the approach that led to through Reykjavik to some serious arms reduction talks. And the START treaties and others were a major step in reducing the temperature of this confrontation. Now, that said, let me set out some reasons why our current international rivalries do not constitute a new Cold War. As has been said by Klaus, but Kristina too, and you just said it yourself, Klaus, there can certainly be sustained and dangerous great power rivalries without their constituting a Cold War. Germany and Russia before World War I, both preoccupied with the Balkans and the balance of power. Likewise, Germany and Great Britain from 1898 on, preoccupied with the naval balance, and each very thinking of the other, the British thinking of the Germans thinking of Britain as encircling them, the British is thinking of the Germans just wanted to be replace them hegemonically, or France and Germany, of course, or more sustained Britain and Russia from 18 Crimea and pre-Crimea until 1907. These are all major long-term confrontations that preoccupied policymakers. They were not a Cold War. The Cold War was not just a great power rivalry, and it wasn't just even the nice metaphor that Lorenz gave us of the chess pieces moving the chess players. It was a totalizing confrontation. It had a nuclear dimension, which still exists, although I think as we think about it, we realize the nuclear weapons cannot really be meant to be used, and they impose a logic of restraint, perhaps. But neither power is really, I think, likely today to threaten nuclear blackmail. But it was totalizing. It had the nuclear dimension. It had certainly the ideological dimension, which has been mentioned by all these speakers. Today, we have ideological differences, but we don't have a universalizing rivalry of communism and anti-communism. China and Russia both seek recognition as great powers. I think the analogy of Russia being sort of, as Britain was in the 1950s, a lesser power. It has lost an empire and hasn't found a role, as Dean Acheson once said. They both want, China and Russia both want to be seen as perhaps hegemonic, certainly China. And the most universalizing ideological claim in play in the world today, I think, is democratization. It's the American belief that this is a type of liberal democracy is something we should be propagating and defending everywhere. And the major ideological enemy today in the United States probably is considered terrorism or Islamism or some fusion of the two. And terrorism was never really identified as a threat in the Cold War. Outside of Europe, that is, the targeting of innocent people for some super cause. Outside of Europe, the Cold War, and this is Lorenz's point, but it was, I think, Westad's point too, is the Second Cold War. We saw every guerrilla movement once we got to once we got to Africa and Asia. We saw all these guerrilla movements as absolutely crucial for the global balance of power, and thus Southeast Asia, Africa, Central America became crucial battlegrounds. And we see certainly a rivalry with China, but fighting over the Belt or trying to counter the Belt and Road Initiative is different from trying to figure out how to deal with Katanga and the Congo. And so we have a novel situation today. Our major ideological threats, as we conceive them, are separate from the major geopolitical threats that we perceive. We see Islamic movements as the former, and China and Russia as the geopolitical ones. Sorry. If the Republican Party today in the United States has a bête noire, it's socialism, which they vaguely attach to the European welfare state and say the Democrats want to foist on the country. But it isn't attached to a great power rival. If the Democratic Party advances an ideological claim, it is human rights. In fact, human rights served during the 1970s, during the Helsinki negotiations and process, and they served well to dismantle the Soviet bloc from within. Helsinki process, even Reagan's overblown rhetoric, take down this wall. At the time it was uttered, nobody thought that any military clash might ensue from this. And human rights is an unwieldy ideology, as we have it, to cultivate alliances, because we ally with so many countries and places that really have contempt for human rights. And another aspect of the Cold War, which I think we should remember, and which I remember, as I said, from the 50s and 60s, is we do not have the demand for loyalty that played so important a role in the earlier Cold War, especially during the years from 1945 to 1960. The issue of loyalty, with its converse of treason, which played so important a role in American politics, doesn't really exist today. It exists within the Republican Party, and the question of fealty to Donald Trump or trying to get beyond him, but it's not a national reproach, and that's because the Communist Party, and I do think here there was a reason, the Communist Party was a party of international scope, and it was different from other parties. At the third international politics, loyalty to Moscow no longer exists. It's instead partial. We have our own version within one party. Now, none of this means that we do not face a very dangerous international situation. Graham Allison has described the Thucydidean trap, that of the declining great power, unwilling to accept second-rank status, confronting a rising and ambitious power. He doesn't mean the Soviet Russia vis-a-vis the United States or the West. He means the United States as the declining power versus China. I think this is a questionable reading of history, but it is at least plausible and discussable. And all the more so since our hegemonic status, our own hegemonic, our quasi-imperial role today has involved many advanced geographical positions: the South China Sea, a commitment to Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, and probably, although there's no formal alliance with Ukraine, an unwillingness to see Russia make further incursions in Ukraine or the Baltic. I think these danger zones, precisely because they are in the periphery of China and Russia, who remain convinced that they should be their protected zones, their Monroe Doctrine areas, so to speak, far from our shores, will see perilous confrontations, and they may be subject to escalation. Now, you'll notice I haven't talked about any danger presented by our economic entanglements with China, which can be a force for peace or conflict. I mean, it comes up when we debate whether Huawei should be something that we adopt, this technology, or whether as the Germans think about the North Star pipeline. But in any case, as you Klaus mentioned, the German-British interdependence did not prevent World War I, despite Norman Angel's analysis in The Great Illusion. And I haven't mentioned yet cyber conflicts and the dangers they may present. I've just no competence in that area. I was disturbed by Donald Trump's trying to go into this Space Force notion. We've got to control space. or they will control space. This is irrationality in the way we did have it in the Cold War. So I feel it as a cause of war, less our general concern with remaining number one than the network of alliances or commitments that we have maintained and which we fear abandoning. They do present agonizing dangers. Should we be prepared to stand up to threats with all the dangers of escalation as took place in Europe in 1914? Or should we be prepared to yield gracefully, as Britain tried to do in Central Europe in the 1930s, which didn't have a great final result? And whichever stance we choose, even assuming we escape major war, we can be certain that the debates about it may well tear apart American politics at home, as similar situations did in the 30s and the 60s, the 1930s and the 1960s. And we can note that we and our rivals, and I don't use the word adversaries, I prefer rivals, that we and our rivals are gearing up for new geopolitical areas of possible confrontation. For instance, I think maybe it was one of you mentioned it earlier, that the Arctic waters of a warming continent, which so far have no treaty framework such as the Antarctic has had since the 1980s, and perhaps space, which our last president thought was worthy of his machismo. So to summarize, who needs a Cold War for a new era of living dangerously?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Indeed, who needs a Cold War? That's a very good question. But let me ask you a follow-up question, maybe refer to what Petra told us, who said that she believes that it is less Russia and China, though there are, of course, some challenges around the corner, but it's more the internal American situation, which is threatening maybe the Western world, definitely American democracy. Would you go along with that the internal threats are larger than the external threats?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would bifurcate them. So yes, I think America is, when I think about which is the most dangerous power in the world today, America is clearly up there, in part because we are at the moment so divided. And I have not lived through a situation in which so many Americans have clearly seem to believe in what we call an alternate reality. I mean, we are, who could, if I were somewhere else, I would not look on this country and think this is a comfortable superpower or ally to have. That doesn't mean we can't pull ourselves together. We did this at the end of the 1930s. We did it at other times. But the degree of danger in this country, division, is just is excruciating. And I'm not sure that calls to bipartisanship are going to resolve it, because I guess I see no healing for this country until the Republican Party divides, systems outright, and we restructure our party framework. So there is a degree of non-rational perception, and I don't. So this is my major worry. I mean, China will is a major power. Well, that can of course be a major power unless there's some collapses, as has happened before with Chinese dynasties, with the Ming and the Qing and others. But it doesn't seem right on the horizon at the moment. And and there are a lot of trends in the world. Yielding Afghanistan to the Taliban, which effectively I think we have done, may be wisdom in one way, but it really saddens me to think that so many women's aspirations are going to be stifled by this retreat. I'm not sure I have an alternative to it, but we have to be prepared. We're not omnipotent, and we can't do everything. And well, we're doing a lot badly. Although I must say I'm a partisan. I think the election results, thank God, gave us a view of a possible way forward. And hopefully a decade from now, we'll have wondered what we were all thinking during this during the period of this 10 years we've been going through.
Thank you very much. We'll have to open it up to questions from the audience, but before we do so, we have a brief commercial break, which will be conducted by Mark Reeves.
Certainly. So we want to share about the books by our distinguished speakers. So we'll begin with Professor Kristina Spohr, who's just released Post-Wall, Post-Square, which in the United States, its subtitle is different from the European title. So the subtitle here in the USA is How Bush, Gorbachev, Kohl, and Deng Shaped the World After 1989, and it's available here in the US from Yale University Press. Professor Spohr has many books that would be of relevance, but probably the most recent single-authored book that she released of relevance would be The Global Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, and the Reshaping of the International Order from Oxford University Press in 2016. Then Professor Lorenz Luethi has written two really exceptional books, which we encourage you to seek out. And most recently, Cold Wars, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, from Cambridge University Press in 2020. And earlier, The Sino-Soviet Split, Cold War in the Communist World, from Princeton in 2008. And as Professor Larres mentioned, Professor Petra Goedde is editor of the premier international history journal in the United States and the world, Diplomatic History. And she recently published The Politics of Peace, A Global Cold War History from Oxford in 2019, and forthcoming in early January 2022 with Akira Irie is International History, A Cultural Approach, which will be coming from Bloomsbury. And finally, from Professor Charles Maier, who's published over many decades, but especially recently, his Once Within Borders, Territories of Power, Wealth, and Belonging Since 1500, which is from Harvard in 2016, and an earlier work relevant to our discussions, Dissolution, The Crisis of Communism, and the End of East Germany, from Princeton University Press in 1997. And last but not least, Professor Larres will be releasing a forthcoming book, Uncertain Allies, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Threat of a United Europe, from Yale, and that is forthcoming in November. So we appreciate each of these guests joining us, and we encourage you to seek out their other work as well. And now we will transition into questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. So please, everyone, rush to Amazon and buy some of the books just mentioned to you. They can all be recommended. Of course, don't just go to Amazon, go also to your local bookstore. They all need our support, please. And that brings me to Brianna, because Brianna will ask the first question now from the audience. Do you have a good question for us, Brianna?
Yeah, okay, so for the first question we have from Ikram from Scotland, who asks, what can be considered as an impetus for the so-called New Cold War?
Shall we ask Kristina?
Sure, I can give it a go. In some ways, picking up a bit also what Charles said earlier. I mean, this is something that's been pushed out by the journalists, and it's been sort of hyped up over all these questions, you know, in the new Russia-China alliance. What is this post-West world order? What is going to be with America's long unipolar moment? Is the Western world under threat in terms of defending its liberal values? You know, and how are we to understand that although we all live together in this global economy, which is of course another hallmark we didn't talk about, which is very different from what we had in the Cold War. We had the closed economic systems of the Eastern Bloc and of China. Then, you know, we have already established really in the last hour and a half that it is perhaps not useful to look at the current situation with terminology that really pertains to a particular era. And I think Charles and I agree, and in terms of how we put it in some ways, there was something about a sort of universality, out of some kind of totality of while there was the sense for 40 years that antagonism affected everything. I'm not saying that, I was a school child on the 9th of November and I was eating my cheese sandwich, and yes, the Cold War in that sense wasn't in my living room. I had my happy Alltag going along as a school kid. But that doesn't, if you ask questions about international order and how they change as questions, and how we as historians answer them, and how we tackle them, and how we look for good words. Do we talk about the ending or an exit from the Cold War? Do we talk about an international system, or whether we are looking at questions that are much, much more niche? Catholic radio stations in Bolivia at the time of the Pope John Paul and Polish activities with solidarity in 1980, 1981. That would be that kind of research that is also going on, which are also very interesting questions to understand what else was going on. But we are looking at, in that sense, the Parisness also in the historical discipline, where questions are being asked are much, much more micro. And we just have to accept that through that sort of fragmentation, we are looking at complete different things than if you're asking big questions about how does state power function, how does leadership work, how does governance work, what is happening to an international order, where we're using different terminologies, where we are looking at different elements. I mean, we heard about, for example, the Arne Westad book on the global Cold War. Let's shift the lens. How did it look from the periphery? We could pick another book that came out that same year by David Reynolds, One World Divisible. It looks at the bipolar world. Yes, it does look at that, but it also has chapters like chips and genes. It looks at completely different developments that are there occurring because we were at that particular point in time of our innovation, of our scientific progress. Of course, there's completely different things going on. We could look at welfare in Pakistan today. That would be a completely different question than saying, what is happening with the big three, the United States, Russia, and China?
Thanks very much. Let's have another question, Brianna. We have so many questions we need to get through, at least some of them.
Okay. Verena wants to know the panelists' opinions regarding the immediate economic and cultural connection between China and the West, especially with Sino-British relations in regards to Hong Kong. So how do you view Hong Kong in the struggle for global economic power?
Who would like to take that question? Petra?
I feel like this is more a question for Lorenz to answer with his Chinese expertise. So I'm not quite sure. Is this person asking about the importance of Hong Kong as a free economic space, or in some ways this is part of the internal control that both China and Russia also are trying to exert about sort of areas on their periphery, and this is sort of the compares to the Russian effort and success in repurposing the Crimea, and also with Ukraine there are areas on the border that are pro-Russian, and also China asserting its control over what it regards as its own territory. And so Western countries like the US or the European Union have in some ways limited leverage. They can support, and they have supported, human rights efforts, and are supporting the democratization effort or the democracy wing in Hong Kong. But ultimately, it is also a very tight walk that the Chinese are walking. And this is where I feel like global capitalism and globalization comes into play. Which is, I think, one, might ultimately be the bigger force that transcends our understanding of the Cold War as well. That right now the situation is so different that these different parts of the world are connected through global trade connections. And Hong Kong is an important hub, financial hub, and the Chinese want to keep that as a hub. And therefore, they have to, that might be the reason why they haven't all out shut down the system, even though they're moving incrementally.
Thank you. Let's also ask Lorenz, but bring in a follow-up question. We have another question here who says that Steve Brady from Pittsburgh, just down the road. How likely is it for China to attack Taiwan? Lorenz.
Okay, maybe I just go back to the Hong Kong question first. Hong Kong for Communist China was the window to the world during the Cold War. That function just isn't there anymore. Shanghai is as important as Hong Kong to China economically, right? So Hong Kong is one of many actually economic centers of China. I think what the importance of Hong Kong, or what happened to Hong Kong, transpired in last year is that China actually is not willing to honor actually its own treaties, because it was supposed to actually honor the internal autonomy in Hong Kong until 2047, according to the handover. It wasn't willing to do that. By the way, it has done that before. It hasn't honored its own 1951 Tibet agreement, right, with the Tibetan authorities, used the pretext to expand actually its control. What is, it doesn't surprise me that China is doing this. What is scandalous is that the West didn't really react to it. And this has something to do with Western disunity and the chaos actually in Western democracies, right? That would have not happened during the Cold War. So I think we really have...
Oh, sorry, I have to interrupt. What kind of action could there be?
Well, first of all, I mean, there's not a lot of action, that given how powerful actually China is. But, there wasn't really a lot of international protest either, right? There wasn't really a lot of political support. There's virtually no protest against what is happening in Xinjiang, right? And this has something to do, this is reflective of the state of Western democracies, that they have abdicated a leading role actually in international moral leadership. And we have, that goes back to the fact, what is the West really about, right? I mean, we have discussed this before.
I want to sort of interject on that, because I think that the US or the West has never challenged China on these kinds of things. Like after Tiananmen Square, the US actually a year later, I think Bush extended most favored nation status to China over huge protests, popular protests in the United States.
Wow.
So there's never been much of a willingness of the West to challenge China on democracy, on human rights, because it is so powerful economically, because it has become such an important trading partner to the West. And therefore, I think that this situation is no different than earlier phases in US, even in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War.
Thank you. Charles, you want to come in here? Or?
Well, I have your question is what can we do? I mean, what can we do for Hong Kong? What can we do for Uyghurs? We are, I think of actions such as, we could say we're not willing to host Chinese students anymore, but these are very costly, and they're not necessarily going to, a lot of these actions are just going to produce, more reaction. I think I'm not, I'm bewildered. This is why I'm not a policymaker, Klaus, because, at the end, I'm always saying yes, and no. I have been interested in borders. The last book was, obviously, I've been preoccupied that question of what they do to the world order in the fact of, sovereignty and the like. But I have no, I don't know. I think we should make it clear that we don't agree. The more agonizing question, I think, must be for the authorities in Hong Kong. How far should they be pushing the envelope or not pushing the envelope? And that's an agonizing choice they're gonna make. I mean, if Chinese troops are gonna cross Kowloon Island, and we're not going to do anything about that, and I don't think we can. If they're going to cross the sea to Taiwan, we have a more difficult choice, and one I think where we could do something and should do something. Ultimately, I don't think the Chinese are willing to push the envelope for a full-scale military conflict with the United States at this time. We still, outpoint them so in military power that can be projected at a distance, and it would shatter their hopes of, Belt and Road will not look as will not have any credibility if they act too far. So there is restraints on both sides, and I think we just have to keep talking and keep encouraging and say these are our values. This is what we believe, and in fact, we also believe you should believe in it too. This is why universality has not quite disappeared. If the Chinese say, well, we have a Confucian order which doesn't, which goes on different ethical principles, at some point we have to say, well, we're sorry. Most of the world, we believe, doesn't think that, and we will speak up for what we believe. So in this sense, I'm an old Cold Warrior, but
didn't quite sound like a Cold Warrior, I must say. Thank you.
Well, Klaus, can I just return, because there was an original question we haven't answered.
Yeah, but briefly, we need to go to
very quickly. First of all, 91, China, after Tiananmen, and now comparing it doesn't work. The reason why the West actually extended, the United States, the most favored nations clause, is to make sure that the reform period actually continues, right? 13 years after 78. Now, the original question was the attack on Taiwan. That's also a really difficult one. This would be a major step for China to take. It would be militarily an extremely costly state. Taiwan will defend itself. It might draw in the United States or Japan into the context. I could imagine that this happens because because the Chinese leadership thinks it is actually secure in the saddle, or it might be, because it's so desperate to stay in power, right? Both could be it. I think it's less likely, but I don't see the future. That's the problem. So with Xi Jinping, you never know.
Thank you. Let's go and ask Mark if he has a question for us.
Yes, we've had a couple people ask, including Patrick Horgan from Edinburgh. How likely is closer strategic alignment of China and Russia in response to Western hostility or perceived weakness to the point of acting in concert? I think I'll direct that to Lorenz and Professor Spohr.
Very quickly, I mean, this is the old ghost of 1950 of the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty, right? And already then the two were not compatible. They're ultimately also actually competitors. And China for a long time has tried essentially to push Russia out of Central Asia or the former Central Asian Soviet republics. So I don't see that there's an alignment. There's too much actually Russian resentment towards Chinese actually influence, not only in Central Asia, but increasingly also in East Europe. So I don't see this alignment, because this would weaken actually Russia much more. One thing what we should also keep in mind is that the Putin regime, the people in power are aging. It increasingly looks to me a little bit like the Brezhnev actually clique of the late 70s, early 80s in the Soviet Union. There will be a generational change. And the question is, to what degree then, where is actually Russia going once this change is coming? And that's, I think, that the really big question that then also will answer, this Sino-Russian actually alignment possibility.
Thank you. Kristina, briefly, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think strategic partnership is a word they like to use together, and alignment is perhaps not useful. But what is very interesting and what is irritating for the United States is that, of course, China is having its One Belt, One Road initiatives. China is definitely on an influence drive economically and geostrategically. But of course, the irritation comes that while, of course, the Russians are worried about China, especially on their southern border, of course, in terms of with their focus on their economy, on the raw materials, they actually need Chinese investments. And they have been actually very good in, for example, getting this Power of Siberia pipeline into China, courtesy of Chinese money. They're trying to run their Northern Sea route as a state-powered project. I'm not saying that these are commercially viable routes necessarily, but if you think of the last Suez Canal problem with the huge cargo ship, you can see why, in terms of propaganda, this may be quite useful for them to talk about as we talk about climate change and the warming of the seas and possible new routes. And we are looking at two countries who can put state power behind commercial activity in a way that Western countries cannot, in the sense that, if a company is not willing to take that sort of risk because it's maybe not economically viable, an authoritarian state may well want to do that. So this is something unpleasant we are still having to look at, which also comes with particular strategic issues, especially when you also think about the unpleasant atmosphere between Russia and NATO countries, including the United States.
Thank you. That brings me to the question about Nord Stream 2. Is that a kind of continuation of the old German politic of Ostpolitik and having relatively good relations with the East, with Russia, much better relations than, let's say, the United States or other Western countries have? So should Nord Stream 2 be supported as a matter of rapprochement with Russia, or should it be seen and condemned as it is largely in the United States? Let me ask Petra first.
I'm not going to come down on either side of this. But you might be right that the perspective, of course, from Central Europe, from Germany, is a different one than from the United States. And that Germany has had economic ties with Eastern Europe since the 1970s. It was sort of one strategy of its Ostpolitik was to open up. So to use economic ties as a political tool toward rapprochement, toward opening up the East. And that is why in the 80s, they wanted to continue that kind of policy. And I think that does guide the current reluctance as well to shut down that particular pipeline. It's also a question of energy policy, which Germans are extremely sensitive to. While they're trying to get away from fossil fuels, while they're trying to kind of, they are shutting down I think they've shut down all but 2 of their nuclear power plants. They do need other sources of energy. They are not quite there yet to go entirely without it.
Can I intervene on this?
Sure.
Yes.
I mean, it's first of all, they want energy. They don't want to produce it at home. I mean, they want clean hands with energy. Secondly, this doesn't seem like, Ostpolitik in the same way. There were Germans across the border. One supported them. One wanted to humanize their existence. I mean, make it easier for them. I'm a great admirer of Mrs. Merkel, but I do not understand why this project is necessary. And face it, it's a source of potential blackmail for Ukraine. It's just going to, Ukraine loses a type of control over, being a conveyor of energy from east to west, and the Russians will have an easier time with, holding the eastern areas or slowly oozing further in. So I must say this is. This strikes me as a short-sighted type of, the trouble with, history. I mean, not a trouble. We work by analogy all the time. And I think this should be said for the audience. We always are grasping like this, is this a new Cold War? Is it this? Is it that? We can only we know only what we have seen images of before. And of course, all analogies are imperfect and we are condemned to them. But I do think we have to learn to think non-analogically as well. But on this,
I agree with you. I didn't mean to say that it is like the OSPA, that it is a tool that they use for political rapprochement, but it is sort of that push toward keeping trade relations open that is important to Germany. It's not for political reasons anymore. Now we might actually have it reversed, that they need to politically get along with Russia in order for some economic reasons. So there is sort of a back and forth, but the political and the economic are very much related. But you are absolutely right that it is not a new kind of Ostpolitik.
Overwhelmingly, Germany's trade is with the other members of the EU. I think. Anyway,
Let me take Kristina as well. She has something to contribute to this very heated discussion about Nord Stream 2. And Lorenz as well.
I just want to say that, of course, yes, we can say roots were in this Osthandel in the 70s and gas oil pipeline projects. But There was something else, of course, which was that Germany didn't want to be dependent on Middle Eastern oil at the time. They went for the nuclear power projects. And so that's how they ended up with the Soviets, later with the Russians in these kinds of deals. But this Nord Stream 2, of course, comes on the back of Nord Stream 1, and Nord Stream 2 was signed by Gerhard Schröder, who, by the way, sits on the board of Gazprom. We have a real big problem that we have a German chancellor who comes from the particular SPD tradition, who is actually in cahoots with the Russians on this. We have also got the problem that Chancellor Angela Merkel, in a very quick turnaround decision, decided to look clean of hydrocarbons and to get coal down. We will also close nuclear power stations. You could say, well, nuclear power, while they're running and while they're running safely, would have probably run cleanly for another 25 years. Was it actually the right decision to do this right now, when you're also trying to get rid of coal and you're also having this Nord Stream 2 problem going on? And now they're in a situation where nobody's daring to stand up, which is exactly the same problem that we had when we had that China discussion 5 minutes ago. Why are Western powers not, like they even did 30 years ago, at least jointly standing up and saying certain things do not work, we need to have a red line? Now, nobody seems to be willing to speak openly what they are standing for. And one thing would be to say, maybe we need to delay this Nord Stream 2, maybe we need to pull out of this for a little while. At some point, just not giving Russians visas because the American embassy is not giving the Russian people any visas, it's hurting the Russian people, it's not hurting the oligarchs. So we have to, call a spade, and I think also really see where is the power also within that Russian regime. Who are the people who are pulling the strings? They're the oligarchs who are having their money tied to the West anyway.
Thank you. There's a cold warrior coming through to some extent. Lorenz.
Very quickly, I want to make the argument in two directions. I agree, Nord Stream is actually bypassing Ukraine, and it actually exposes Ukraine to Russian influence. I agree with that. So in that, and there's the issue of blackmail. I'm a little bit more careful with this argument because what in the last Ukrainian oil crisis some years back, what the Russians have realized is that their customers can also walk away from Russian oil, right? They need actually to produce, to keep actually oil and gas going. They cannot risk actually, the blackmail because it actually will hurt them too. What I find interesting in this discussion is, this is a discussion that mirrors the 1950s and 1960s, where then when the Russians tried to push actually on the international energy markets with oil and gas, and we have exactly the same arguments, blackmail, we give the Russians money or the Soviets money at that time. And the interesting thing is, in the late 50s and early 60s, it was American energy companies that made these arguments. And they were a little bit too self-interested, these arguments. So we should also keep that in mind. There is a very competitive energy market, and Germany is a market where producers want to sell.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think we have to move on. I noticed a question from a gentleman from Pakistan, which is good. I'm always welcome an international audience, and we do not have that many viewers from Pakistan, so we should take that question. Mark or Brianna, who would like to lead the question? Mark, have you got it?
Sure. So Willie Khan from Pakistan asks, will China's One Belt, One Road initiative have any impact on, the question says new Cold War, but I'm loath to use that term, but on global developments, we'll say.
Charles.
Well, if it's successful, yes. It's ambitious. I don't think it's, we can interpret it with more or less hostility. I mean, I was in Senegal 2 years ago, and there was some development in Dakar, port development with Chinese characters all over it. We know about the Eastern Mediterranean. It all depends upon how much the Chinese want to politicize it, because it can backfire too. I think if it's used purely as a tool for, in a sense, projecting great power politics, it will. Is it an equivalent of the Marshall Plan? It's not quite so strategic. So I think in this sense I agree with Katrina, this is a place where I think if it has economic benefits for other countries and they can manage to accept these installations without having generalized, political capitulations to China, it's a good thing generally. I'm generally for foreign investments, and I don't think it should cause it needs to cause a escalation of what you might call a new totalizing rivalry.
And you could also add to that it actually motivates the Biden administration to think about their own infrastructure program and to cooperate with Japan and the Western Europeans in order to bring that about. And you could also argue that's long overdue. And of course, Chinese competition has perhaps helped them to make them see
well,
that.
I mean, if the Chinese wanted to offer us infrastructure in the port of Philadelphia or something, it might be interesting.
That's right. Okay, Brianna, let's go to the next question, please.
Is it possible to argue that our competition with China today is more totalizing than our competition with the Soviet Union during the Cold War?
And who did that? Who asked this question?
It was an anonymous question.
Who would like to answer that, Petra? And then
No.
Okay, I mean, I can jump in.
Lorenz would like to answer that.
It's also a little bit related to the previous question. I mean, the totalizing aspect, China is making strategic investments across the world, right? Whether this is now the One Road, One Belt initiative, or it's the Athens Harbor or the Panama Canal, or a harbor in Sri Lanka or Africa or Latin America, it is very clear that China is making actually strategic investments. And usually what most people or observers think, there have never any political strings attached. The West, if it makes investments in, let's say, non-Western world, usually puts in political strings, you have to improve human rights records and all of that stuff. So it looks like that China has a certain advantage. However, what we know from Africa, some African countries, there's also a turn against China, particularly when Chinese trade moves in and Chinese merchants move in and they push out actually local businesses. It can actually turn against China very, very quickly. And China is at the moment sort of in a retrenchment phase and looking at, maybe rethinking the sheer size of investments. They have actually pretty much gone down in the last couple of years. So is it a totalizing experience, similar to the Cold War with the Soviets? It might look like this if you just look at these investments, right? But again, there are so many things that are missing, the nuclear threat, for example, the ideological threat, even if it was irrationally perceived in the West, as much larger than it was, it's just not there. It might, however, change if China really tries now to translate its economic investments into some form of an ideological challenge, Neo-Confucianism or Xi Jinpingism or whatever it is. That might change the equation, but I don't see that. I don't see that China is willing to export its political system the way the Soviet Union actually did it, and to a certain degree the United States did too, right?
Thank you. Isn't the big
just want to add to that it is really interesting that we have been talking in the current situation primarily about economics, about investments, and not about a political or military threat. And I think that is something that we have to keep in mind, that we're talking about a capitalist system, capitalist competition here. And China has outdone the West in some ways, or has caught up with the West in playing the capitalist game, which means that issues like free trade, that was for the longest time for the United States a really good policy, now all of a sudden looks different because there is a different kind of competitor. And therefore, it's no surprise that Trump began sort of this protectionist phase. That is not, Biden has not eliminated that yet. Biden has not eliminated these protective tariffs. That this is one of the biggest differences to the Cold War, that it is in the economic realm. China is primarily an economic threat, and we're looking, of course, at human rights violations and all these other things. But I have the funny feeling, are secondary to these other bigger, what these countries are considering bigger.
Quickly, this is. I agree with this, and Klaus obviously has, Lorenz has, an expertise here, which I envy, and I agree with his assessments. But I do wonder whether the growing preoccupation about cyber stuff is just reducible to economics. I mean, it is about information and control of information, and the propaganda organ I worry about most is Fox News, and not out of China. But I think this dimension, especially since it's tied to technologies, is important.
Thank you. I think it goes beyond economics. It has something to do with efficiency. For example, look at the global health crisis. That goes beyond economics. And here the Chinese, of course, claim they are much better. They're doing things in a more efficient way. And I think that is the new ideology, the great efficiency, including public health and safety. And I think that is what we will have to deal with, I think. But still, let's ask for the next question from Brianna, please.
Yeah, David, a high school student at Carolina Friends School from Chapel Hill, asked, is it feasible or even likely that this new Cold War could evolve into a military conflict involving the United States? So possibly a proxy war in Southeast Asia, or U.S. support of Ukrainian forces? And would it be more or less probable that China or Russia may involve themselves into such a conflict?
Lorenz, briefly, maybe I can ask everyone briefly what they think. Will there be a military conflict between the US and China in the foreseeable future?
I don't want to go into the proxy wars, because I never could conceptually actually wrap my hand around what the proxy war is. But given what China is doing in terms of a naval build-up in the South China Sea, and that touches on international trading routes, and the Taiwan issue, I certainly can see that there might be military clashes. Whether this will be a war is a completely different question. This depends again on what is going on in China. What is the reason for a Chinese regime to go to war? Maybe it's desperate because of domestic conflict or domestic weakness. I would also just caution a little bit to see, China as this giant that is efficient. Many of the statistics are not to be trusted, and there's a lot of internal conflict in China that can have a stabilizing role in China, and might lead, in fact, to a military strike in order to play the nationalist card.
Yeah, thank you. And we should perhaps talk more about how cooperation is possible rather than whether there will be a war. But still, the question was about war. Petra, do you want to come in?
It's interesting that many of the commentators and the questions are just assuming that there is a new Cold War, even though I think all of us have said that this is not the case. So that's the first point I want to make. The second one is that I agree with Lorenz. These proxy wars, they're more complicated. They were more complicated during the Cold War, and they would be more now. I want to point to some books like Lin Hang Nguyen's book on Hanoi's War, that looks at the Vietnam conflict from the Vietnamese side and looks at what the local conflicts were. That was something that Lorenz pointed out in his presentation, that these are really important local conflicts that might get some help from one side or another, but it doesn't necessarily should deserve to be called proxy wars in the process, because these local groups will try to find support and military support from whatever power is willing to give them that support. And that then creates, in some ways, what from the Western point or from the Cold War standpoint of the two superpowers looks like a proxy war.
Thank you. Kristina, do you want to briefly come in?
I was just going to say that I don't think the Americans have a particular strong appetite now to get involved in any such kind of wars. I mean, look at how they pulled out of Afghanistan. You have to ask yourself what kind of wars they have been involved in the last 30 years with more or less success and for different reasons. So I think we shouldn't sort of ratchet it up to there's war in the next 10 years. I think there would be any work done to avoid war. I think people will probably work more on a war avoidance strategy than preparing for war as such.
Okay, thank you. Charles, are you equally
I agree with Lorenz. A proxy war, it's a little bit, as the Germans would say, Quatsch. I mean, it was never the right term. I think if there's a danger, it's in the logic of escalation and upbidding. I mean, I sometimes try and use the notion of, poker when I consider the 1914 crisis with my students. Each side thinks it has to go one incremental step, and that can't be too dangerous. And at the end, it leads to a chain of events where nobody wants to back down. So it's that logic, and I think there is a danger of war in these border areas, South China Sea or elsewhere in Asia, or I don't think it's there in Crimea yet. But people lose control of situations. History is not the controllable game.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this sober assessment. Can I ask, because we are rapidly running out of time, can I ask our panelists if they can stay with us for another few questions before we, another maybe 10 minutes, and then we bring it to an end? Would that be okay? Mark, would you ask, let's say another 10 minutes and then we finish it. So Mark, would you ask the next question, please?
Yes, I have a couple questions from a graduate student here at UNC, Pasut Totavisansuk. So this first one maybe is for Professor Goedde, which is, does a lower general sense of fear mean the prospects for peace are better in the world today, or are we less likely to have peace movements similar to those during the Cold War precisely because of this lack of fear? And then I'll ask a follow-up question to Professor Spohr, which is, was there a loss of an opportunity in 1989 to have a kind of global Helsinki to settle the Second World War in a more global sense? And is that part of what has led to our instability today? So we'll begin with Professor Goedde.
And can I ask for a brief answer so we can get a few more questions in?
I'll try. So fear is a powerful motivator, which we have seen in the domestic context, the anti-immigration sentiments. And yes, in general, the higher the level of fear is, the more likely do we have sort of movements to, did we have to end the Cold War during the Cold War? There were various moments where the peace movement was especially strong. One was in the immediate post-war period. That's not a peace movement, but in 1954 was in the aftermath when people realized we are contaminating our environment. There was a very strong peace movement against nuclear testing. It died down once the test ban treaty was signed, and the next big moment was in the early 1980s, and this is something that shaped my youth because I was a teenager during that time. I was a young high school student, and I remember the fear of stationing nuclear warheads in Eastern and Western Germany, and also being ground zero in a sense, and that created a powerful incentive for peace movements. We had a breakout of a peace movement with Iraq with the first Gulf War, and again in the U.S. in the second. With the second Gulf War. So yes, there's less likelihood for a peace movement if there's less fear in the process.
Thank you. Kristina.
Okay, on the global Helsinki, well, we had an interesting moment. In fact, we had that moment when Bush declared the New World Order in August 1990, and then the world proceeded to think at the UN, in the UN Security Council, in a sort of, let's call it an East-West honeymoon with the Soviets, Chinese, Americans, France, Britain, and the others on the Security Council to agree that one would hold onto the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Kuwait, and that Saddam Hussein would have to leave, and that did not entail regime change in Iraq, but that entailed the reinstatement of Kuwaiti sovereignty, irrespective whether one liked the regime in Kuwait or not that was there before the invasion. So that is where we saw this return to the idea that let's use the UN, let's use international law, let's get an international authority. In fact, all the countries tried to work together. And it seemed to be a moment indeed of that New World Order, of a cooperative two pillars, namely the two still existing more or less superpowers, although there was a power asymmetry, to work together. And it worked. That was sort of a picture perfect circumstance. But as you know, then Yugoslavia implodes, Soviet Union collapses, there's problems on the Horn of Africa and Somalia, and before you know it, people are thinking, if we apply those norms and principles in international law, who are the ones enforcing it? Should it be the United States? Who is it? Has the United Nations got the capacity? It turned out they didn't. And I don't want to rehash what happened in the 30 years since, but that's where you can see where the problems were. We actually had an organization, we had international law, we tried to apply it, but the question is who does the dirty work when it comes to question of peace enforcement or even of enforcing norms?
Thank you. That's for another discussion. Thank you. Brianna, can you ask the next question, please?
Yeah, so Ikram from also asked, it has been pointed out that one of the main constituents of the Cold War was an ideological antagonism, which is missing in the contemporary confrontation between the US-led West and against Russia and China. So how would you then explain both Russia and China not wishing to adopt the American way of life and demand on a regular basis that the US-led West must stop trying to export their democracy to Russia and China?
Who asked that?
Ikram from Scotland, I believe.
Okay, a viewer from Scotland. Very good. Who would like to ask that to answer that question? Charles.
I thought you would ask me. I think it's sort of a residue. It's what I would call an ideological residue. Yes, we have our positions, and of course they're taken up, and I don't. But it isn't where we think that the whole conflict is oriented around these ideologies, as we did believe, whether rightly or wrongly, or in the Cold War. That, in other words, we were fighting Soviet communism, contesting it because it was inherently expansionistic, based on Marxist-Leninist principles. No one is claiming that sort of, that sort of totality. For this, yeah, there are different principles, and I don't think. I mean, and Putin is increasingly defined his as that of the Russian traditionalism, whether the Orthodox Church, that picture of him piously holding a candle the other day, or Chinese ones. But there's a difference in quality, I think, between this type of brandishing of values, so we can brandish values, and the brandishing and the centrality of value conflict that there was in the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you. Mark, you want to ask another question?
Certainly. So Diane Kirby from Trinity College Dublin asks, following the end of the Second World War, the Cold War justified and legitimated American global interventionism as a force for good, defending Western civilization from the evil Soviets. And so she asks that perhaps it serves American interests in interventionism today to present its current struggle to retain global hegemony from rising rivals as a new Cold War. So is the use of the Cold War concept simply an instrumental concept to justify US power? Professor Luethi, would you like to tackle that one?
All right. So there is this question of American interventionism in the Cold War. First of all, it existed already in the 19th century, American interventionism in Latin America. We forget this, actually, how often this happened. It was also in the interwar period. We have just to think about Mexico or Haiti or Nicaragua, right? So I can go on here. Interestingly, I think immediately after 1945, there's less American interventionism. I mean, what changes is really the Korean War. The Korean War convinces the Americans in this, what Petra said, sort of irrational fear-mongering, to globalize actually the Cold War. This is when alliance building around the Soviet periphery really happens. And this is also where probably interventionism happens. Also, many of the cases that we talk about, like Iran and Vietnam, 53 and 54, wouldn't really fall under American interventionism. They are more complicated stories. But, you know, yes, I think maybe what here the issue is that over the course of the Cold War, there is a particular American form of entitlement to intervene. So maybe, you know, a Kennedy doctrine instead of a Brezhnev doctrine, right? I mean, I pick now any American president, and that has then been translated into the Cold War period. But this is sort of a reading, a backwards reading of history of, you know, Americans actually now in the 90s behaving as a unipolar actually superpower, and then try to see antecedents in American Cold War policy. I don't see the connections, these close connections. I don't see, you know, a consistent actually behavior here across time.
Thank you very much. Let me ask a question posed by Michael Hopkins from the University of Liverpool in the UK. Let me ask that as a final question, because it's a kind of hopeful question. We talked about fear and terror and all that sort of thing. But what about positive emotions, optimism and looking forward and being constructive and being peaceful? Has that not also shaped the world during the Cold War? And is it perhaps possible that we will be guided by these emotions rather than these more negative emotions? Petra, that's a question for you.
Yes, I agree. And in some ways, the book I wrote about the politics of peace was as much about turning these negative emotions into positive ones. There was a lot of stress of the commonality of humanity. These peace advocates said we have a lot more in common with our brethren and sisters from the other side of the Iron Curtain. We all have the same fears about nuclear war. So we should get along even if we have ideological differences. And that was in many ways quite a positive message. At the time, they were derided as idealists, and even historians later on. I remember I went to a talk about realist historians and political scientists, where the speaker said, well, we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. So that's sort of the stereotype of the peace advocate. And I was determined in a way, I wouldn't say that this sparked my interest in writing the book I did, but it sort of sat kind of uneasily with me that the positive sense of a common humanity, human rights advocates would be considered as naive and something we should avoid. But that was the consensus among policymakers, anti-communists in the 1950s. They in fact did argue publicly in committee meetings that those who advocated peace were a threat to national security and need to be shut down. So they banked on the fears of their populace in the Cold War era. And yes, we can apply the same thing now to just appeal. And I think environmentalists are doing that right now. So I wanted to actually bring this in terms of fear as a motivating factor. Right now, we do see a very strong environmental movement, and it is born out of fear that the planet will not feed us anymore in the future. And that is also ultimately an effort to turn a negative fear into something positive, to say we all need to kind of find common solutions to that, which also applies to the pandemic, that as much as borders were shut, there was a need to work together to create a solution and a cure to this global pandemic.
And regarding environmentalism and climate change, there is, of course, optimism that something can be done about it, because otherwise we would just give up. And that is, of course, a good thing. Kristina, would you like to come in about these positive emotions?
I can actually pick up from what Petra said, because I'm thinking positive emotions, positive things. For example, what were all these people protesting for at the end of the Cold War? Freedom of speech, freedom of gathering, traveling, all these kind of things. Something that was so-called soft power that was inherent in the Western system, that you don't need state policies to foster those. They are somewhere inherent in a human being, that they want to express opinions. And also think about the pandemic when the borders were shut. where did the vaccines come from? They came from within the open system. So I'm actually not at all too worried, too defensive about, oh, we are confronted with, authoritarian, strong regimes that have, strong state-sponsored companies, etc., etc. I think we also have to have faith in this sort of, the spark, the electric spark, if you so want, that you have when you have people talking and thinking and doing all this brainstorming. And I think that is actually an inner strength that we just have to recognize that we have as living in open societies.
Okay, thank you very much. Lorenz, yeah.
Now, I just when I listened to Petra and Kristina, what sort of came to my mind is that all three of us belong to one generation. We were teenagers in the 80s. And maybe we have just a very positive view and very optimistic view, because what we experienced is 89 and 90, not in East Europe. I think all of us were in West Europe, right? And, even for West Europeans, the world opened up. The 90s were this period where everything was possible, right? And I still live in the 90s emotionally, right? That, if you work hard, you can get a job, you can get your book out, and you make a career. And I think this is particular to our generation. When I talk with my students, they are much more cynical and much more pessimistic. They grew up, with homes that were foreclosed in the big crisis, right, in 2009 or whatever. They come of age in a pandemic where they should fall in love. I see the frustration. And I think this is really the way you grow up and when you are politically actually shaped, right, in your late teens, in your 20s. He sort of has an impact the way how you look at life. And we three, I talk about three, and maybe Klaus as well, right? We have this particular optimistic view because we experienced the 90s where everything was possible.
Thank you very much. Klaus, is it generational?
Well, it is in part, and I guess, Petra's notion that you need fear to bring hope, or that's sort of the implication. That doesn't cheer me necessarily, but I think hope. I'm all for hope, and in some ways I'm an optimist, and I don't like catastrophic views of what's likely to happen. But I think this is maybe hard to express. I think hope is a duty. I think we must continue to hope, even in the face of adversity and in the face of evidence, in the face of trends, because there's no other choice for us in the world, but in a sense to do constructive work. Now that may not be a movement to do, for policy, but it means, with climate change, I think we will have to live on the earth, whatever it is, and we will make the best of it, and we can make it much better than, or much worse. And so I guess I find hope is like is sort of a duty, like a Christian duty or another duty. So I would say, whether you comes easily or not, there's no alternative.
I think the hope comes through the movement. It is people who start a movement out of, that is born out of fear that express that kind of hope in the process. And I want to actually get back to Loren's opening statement about the Berlin Wall and how that was a local thing, because I made a mental note to get back to this. Because I'm actually a little bit older than you, I think. So I was already in the United States when the wall came down. And I remember it as an event. It was interesting for me as a German to look at it, to see it on American television. And the kind of sensation, and Charles knows this because he was here. Klaus, I don't think you were in the US, was tremendous. And everybody knew that moment in the US also, that we were living through a deep historical moment. And that's sort of part of what I'm not saying that emotions is the only way to describe the Cold War, but this, if there was an end to the Cold War in emotional terms, this was it, the falling of the Berlin Wall. And it is still considered in a way that emotional center point. And it was, as you said, it was not that important to people. It wasn't even that important it didn't change people's lives in Western Germany even. They had the 30th year celebration in the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was in Germany, and I listened to East German and West Germans described how their lives changed. And the West Germans all said, well, it didn't change that much, my life. But the East Germans said, there's a before and an after. Everything that happened before the wall came down was different from what their life looked like afterwards. But it was a global moment, and I think it's recognized as that still.
I agree with Petra. I mean, you know, for 28 years, I just thought, well, there are always going to be two Germanys, and they're just hopeless reactionaries who were trying to say that Germany should be united. But it was a moment. It was a transcendent. It was like, you know, like the fall of the Bastille is not just a local moment. There are moments that give you the sense that much more is possible. Much more of emancipation is possible. Yes, Petra, you may need a movement to push forward concrete ideas out of that, but you need individuals just themselves to have their own courage to hope, as well as the movements. But 1989 was something. That's why I wrote the book. The book I did. I mean, it was just. You know, I never thought I'd see this, and I had to write all these books about nasty people and what had happened. And here was, it will remain the most hopeful book I've written, actually.
Thank you very much. I think we need to come to an end, but I think.
Can I, however, answer, you know,
no, we have to finish it now.
Yeah.
The hope we take away from tonight, I think, is that there is hope that we should do constructive work, and that in the end we may actually turn it around if we are both lucky and, well, good at what we do. I would like to thank all of our contributors tonight. You know, we went on for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and over half of our audience is still with us, which I think is a great compliment to our 4 participants. Lorenz Luethi, Charles Maier, Kristina Spohr, and Petra Goedde, and also our 2 Krasno assistants, Dr. Mark Rees and Brianna Weaver. It's great to have all of you here. Thank you very much for this very lively and engaged discussion. And I would like to tell our audience that this was, again, the final Krasno event for this semester. However, we will continue next September 2021, for the fall semester. For tonight, let me thank you again for being so patient, for being with us still, and particularly, of course, to our participants for doing some very enlightening discussion here, for helping us looking through the Cold War and the post-Cold War era. And there will be more exciting events to come in the fall. And perhaps we can welcome one or all of our current participants again in the future. This would be particularly great. Thank you very much, and good night to everyone.
Good night.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you all again. Some for the first time.
Thank you. No, it was great to have you here. Thanks very much. Bye.